My first job, I described it as I was a glorified telemarketer. I spent my entire day calling founders. I had a phone and a desktop machine, and I sit at my desk, and every day I would call like 20 founders. That was my job. And I would call them up, and some founders would say, they would hang up the phone and say, who is this? I don't want to take this call. They didn't think if a VC would be calling, but some founders would pick up the phone and I would ask them questions. I would say, hey, I'm calling from Insight Partners and we're a venture fund. We invest in software companies. I want to tell you about what we do, and then I want to learn about your company. And every now and again, I would talk to founders that were building real companies. They would say, hey, I've got 5 million of revenues and I've got 100 customers. Or in some cases, it'd be I've got 10 million of revenues and 500 customers or whatever it would be. And we would be looking for companies that were bootstrapped, right? And the signals that we would be looking for would be things like revenue growth, customer growth. The way I would source was basically I would look at, this is going back a ways, but I'd be reading like trade publications, going to conferences, looking for evidence of growth. And the goal was to figure out where is their adoption of the product, right? And what that taught me was to be data-driven, but also to let the data guide me rather than to let my perceptions around what's interesting guide me. And the value in that was to start to understand that from the outside looking in, you can have a lot of suppositions and assumptions, but oftentimes those may not be correct. Or you might have a belief that's somewhat correct, but there may be some nuance around what's really happening under the hood. And so that model was really valuable. So I invested in Insight for about 8 years, and I saw that firm really grow and scale, and we were able to invest in some really good companies. And what was so interesting to me was many of the companies that we didn't invest in, and we usually didn't invest in them because they were too early for our firm, those became the huge winners, right? So I talked to Facebook when it was like 10 people, right? And it had crazy web traffic.
Ouch.
Yeah, that's a whole story, but that's a true story, actually.
And yet you still have an amazing hit rate of like 9 out of 19 at Insight Partners.
Yeah, but that one would have been bigger than every other one. That's another story. But long story short, what tipped me off to that one was web traffic, crazy growth in web traffic. It was actually before it had revenue. And that was the reason Insight, there's a bunch of reasons why Insight didn't invest. But one reason was it was earlier than we typically would invest because we looked for revenue, we looked for actual traction. They had web traffic growth that was kind of off the charts, but they didn't have revenue. And it was unclear at the time, it was like the first year, why they were going to monetize. And people didn't know what a social media network was. And there was a lot of reasons it wasn't a fit for Insight. But there were companies like that that really were starting to hit inflection points in terms of their early growth. And so I would use things like web traffic analysis and download growth and those types of things to identify companies that had a chance of success.